If you're typing, you might want to mute. Yes. We are now live with my two fantastic guests, and just starting the feed in just 30 seconds. All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is Bassam Haddad. I am very excited to be sharing with you that we are having this conversation under the title The 2020 Election and Whatnot. And the subtitle is Now What? And we have with us two of the most remarkable analysts and, in my view, commentators on a number of issues that will be coming up today, even though their expertise is way and wider than what we will be addressing today. Mouin Rabbani and Char Miller. Before I introduce you guys, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Bassam.
Mouin joins us from Amsterdam, and Char joins us from Virginia. So, from Washington, D.C., but he teaches in
I'm in The
Virginia.
Hague.
You're in The Hague, Mouin? I didn't get anything right. Mouin is in The Hague and Char is in Washington, D.C. This discussion will revolve around the now what question. The elections are over, and now what at the domestic and at the more international level in terms of foreign policy. We will be addressing a number of issues having to do with what's next at both of these levels. Mouin Rabbani is an independent analyst, commentator, and researcher specializing in Palestinian affairs, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and the contemporary Middle East. He has previously served as principal political affairs officer with the Office of the UN Special Envoy for Syria, head of Middle East with Crisis Management Initiative, Martti Ahtisaari Centre, and senior Middle East analyst and special advisor on Israel-Palestine with the International Crisis Group. Rabbani is co-editor of Jadaliyya and contributing editor of Middle East Report. He has published, presented, and commented widely on Middle East issues, including for most major print, television, and digital media. Welcome, Mouin. Char Miller's work focuses on the political aesthetics and disciplinary technologies, which is to say that he's interested in the art and design of political power. He received his PhD from Johns Hopkins University and tends to treat ancient sources as contemporaries, such as reading Plato in order to think about political relationship with algorithms, or reading Paul as a useful interlocutor for thinking about global climate crisis. His more recent book, Cities on the Plains, examined the role of violence in the construction of political community. His previous book, Tailored Citizenship, explored conceptions of economic discipline in the 20th century. He's published in Political Theory, Theory and Event, PS, Political Science, and the Journal of American History. He's finishing a book project at this point, titled Draining Money, which examines money as a political and theological form of sovereignty. He and Mouin are also, in terms of full disclosure, are colleagues and friends of mine that I am very, very fortunate to have. Gentlemen, we have had three other interviews in this series previously, with Jennifer Victor, Marieli Lopez Santana, and Libby Anchor, Elizabeth Anchor, and we addressed the pre-election period. At this point, I'd like to ask both of you to share with me your thoughts, any generic thoughts on the election, but also with an eye to what you each will be focusing more on, where Mouin is addressing foreign policy a bit more than Char, and Char addressing now what inside the United States in terms of where things are going. So I'll give you each a couple of minutes to do opening comments, and then I'll ask specific questions. Char, would you like to start, since we're dealing with the current domestic situation at this point?
Sure. I'd love to go first. Thank you for that introduction, Sam. Where to start is a pretty big question right now, in that some things don't seem to be able to end very well. And so I guess kind of where we are now and where we're going, I mean, one of the big takeaways I would think a person should have after the last 4 years of Trump and the kind of recent experience of Trump is a kind of respect for the lack of democracy in the United States, or an increased seriousness with which a question about how democratic the United States is a pretty crucial question. And I think the election itself has been a really great exploration of the ways that, from the Electoral College to the refusal to the ability of a president to flaunt norms that without any repercussions, possibly. All of these kind of ways in which this president, has not just sort of been an extravagant display of anti-democratic behavior, but has actually just exposed very serious structural limitations on even thinking of the United States as a democracy. Again, that would be my big kind of claim, or my big area of focus, with a whole bunch of other kind of more specific questions about right now, in kind of watching the United States experience a coup, which it strikes me as what is happening, kind of regardless of whether it succeeds or not, and regardless of the fact it looks kind of silly in a bunch of ways. What you do is you can see how a president could pull this off, right? And could ignore a whole range of democratic norms and a whole range of democratic actual sort of institutions. So I guess that would be my kind of initial statement. Is one thing that strikes me at this moment in time, after having gone through the election, is in the United States, is the kind of the weakness of it as a democracy.
Thanks, Char. I'll ask you a few more questions following this 2-minute intro. Mouin, any opening remarks before we get into the nitty-gritty?
Sure. Well, I think the conventional wisdom is that there was kind of a global massive sigh of relief when the election results came in and it became clear that Trump has lost. And while I think that is generally true for many of the traditional allies of the U.S., it's not universally true. So, for example, in Europe, or at least most of Europe, there was indeed an enormous sigh of relief, given all the disruption and norms shattering conduct of the Trump administration over the past 4 years, very much along the lines of what Char was just saying. At the same time, I think it's important not to conflate relief with the defeat of Trump with joy at the election of Biden. And here I'd like to make several observations. First of all, just getting back to my first point, if you look, for example, at the Middle East, virtually all of the US's traditional allies, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, and so on, were actually very strongly in support of a second Trump term, to put it simply, because they were feeding at the trough for 4 years, and there was virtually no agenda or aspiration they had that the United States opposed under Trump. And then even in Europe, for example, I think the United Kingdom under Boris Johnson, its agenda moving forward in terms of Brexit and a trade deal with the US and so on was very much tied with the second Trump administration. And that's now kind of all been thrown into question. Now, moving forward, I think there are two issues to keep in mind. The first is that the so-called return to normalcy that many people are speaking about will not self-generate. One can't simply pretend that the past 4 years didn't happen and kind of pick up as if it's 2016 again. If you look, for example, at the Europeans, yes, there's a lot of relief at Trump presumably departing the scene in January, but the experience of the past 4 years has also raised all kinds of question marks about the relationship with the United States moving forward. The second is that I think Biden is very much in the mold of the traditional bipartisan US foreign policy consensus of the post-World War II period. So, if I'm not mistaken, during his lengthy Senate career, there was never a US war that he didn't support, and so on. And so, the real question to me, I think, in the past 4 years is what will the balance of forces on foreign policy be between the Democratic establishment and, let's say, the bipartisan consensus that Biden very much represents, and to what extent will this be challenged, successfully or otherwise, by new emerging constituencies within the Democratic Party and perhaps more broadly in U.S. society. And I think, moving forward in the next 4 years, there are going to be a lot of questions that need to be posed and answered. Just one last point. I think, irrespective of who would have won the last elections, the most immediate issue the U.S. is going to have to deal with is Iran, because of Trump's renunciation of the nuclear agreement and 4 years of maximum pressure. Had Trump won, I think the U.S. and Iran would have been very much on the road, most likely to some form of military confrontation. Biden has already stated his intention to rejoin the nuclear agreement, but these things are easier said than done. Again, there's a legacy of the past 4 years. Biden will probably seek some kind of amendment to this agreement and may even get European support for it. But let's not forget, the Iranians have a much, I think, have a much better justification for also seeking amendments to the agreement, given the experience of the past 4 years, and how this plays out over the course of the next year. I think could have major consequences for the Middle East.
Is this all you have to say for the whole discussion? Because you took several minutes. No, I'm joking. This was supposed to be.
Done.
This was supposed to be a 2-minute intro, but thank you. You're not on CNN or BBC or Al Jazeera where you have to get it all out before they move forward. But I'm gonna try to ask you other questions going forward because I have questions that are specific, and I think it will allow you to expand a bit later on. If you guys can keep your question or your answers to a couple of minutes each, we can go back and forth, and I'd love some feedback on each other's points, maybe halfway down the line. Thank you very much, both of you. And even though I promised to stop saying thank you, I still do it every single time. What can I say? Char, I have a question regarding the domestic situation, and that is, are we witnessing a coup attempt or something of the sort? Is it fair to call it such, or if not, what is it? What are we witnessing today with Trump's refusal to concede, and within that sort of venue, what is the work that needs to be done to basically have something like democracy in the United States with respect to the election and where we are at right now, and at the same time, and this is a loaded question, how to keep the pressure on Biden. A lot of people that I have been speaking with, including myself, say, okay, now Biden is elected. Now is the time to to basically, quote unquote, fight Biden, or push Biden to not move back to the center or even center right, and relinquish the message and so on, that on which himself and much of the Democratic Party has been running.
And we only have 2 minutes. Is that the deal there?
No. You can actually take 2 minutes for each of these questions, given that Mouin already took a lot of time.
I guess I'd go back to the very first one, because I sort of think that it actually is a pretty revealing question in a couple ways. Is this really a coup? I mean, on the one hand, it strikes me that that's been pretty consistently Trump's move throughout his presidency. Is you wonder, is this thing really happening? And given a kind of background of American exceptionalism, lots of people sort of think well, no, it's not that bad. And I think actually, so part of my answer would be you won't know that it was a coup until it's kind of too late to do anything about it. And that it isn't a done deal, right? I mean, that Trump is always sort of acting in time, in the sense of responding to events and creating new possibilities. So it isn't this is going to be a coup and he's going to conduct it. I mean, and in fact, I think, it's not going to be a fixed thing until it happens. And Trump is very ready to play any number of options that come out of it. And in fact, I would kind of dwell on this for a minute, because I think I kind of think that that's a real mode for Trump, or sort of kind of gives us an additional insight into Trumpism, right? That part of the way he plays this, and I think people want to talk about the gaslighting, that Trump is sort of gaslights you a bit into, or the whole kind of Trump apparatus gaslights you into not being able to trust your own responses to things. And that's certainly kind of going on here. But I was kind of there's something wrong about the gaslighting metaphor with Trump, I think. And that's the movie that's drawn from, the Hitchcock movie Gaslight. Charles Boyer is the sort of bad character who's gaslighting Ingrid Bergman. And he's very serious all the time. He's very trying to convey to her that he cares about her feelings as he's manipulating those feelings. That's not Trump, right? I mean, Trump plays it as a joke until it's not a joke. So Trump can be, so, and I think that, again, it's kind of operative here with this coup discussion, is at any moment, he's just it's a joke and I was just joking. And everybody kind of oh, okay, of course he was just joking. That's a pretty funny joke. Or it isn't a joke and he kind of pulls it off. And so there's this way in which any serious response to Trump is always kind of undercut by the winking and nudging he's doing to his followers. And I think that's a pretty big phenomenon, actually. And kind of trying to think about, the various ways his behavior manipulates the public. I mean, the guy's a kind of TV reality shows stand-up wannabe. So if you watch these rallies, I mean, he's not really funny, but he's trying to be funny. And in the kind of rush of saying anything to provoke the base, but always able to claim it's a joke at the point you get called on it. So I guess that's one pitch to sort of thinking about the way Trump has used this comedic element to now put himself in this position. At the one hand, looking pretty ridiculous as an attempted coup, right? I mean, they just don't have the votes. It's looking Biden has 5 million more overall votes than Trump, maybe 7 by the time all the votes are counted. I mean, it's absurd, but it isn't. At the same time, he's firing Esper. He's getting rid of the and clearly that was a huge tale, right? I mean, that he fired the Secretary of Defense the first thing upon losing the election. That strikes me he was seriously thinking of this as a coup and having the military back him up if nobody else was. So again, I would say it isn't a coup until it is a coup, and the other thing is like never like the sort of running side next to a joke has always been Trump's kind of get out of jail card, right? That he could say like, I'm not going to test. I've tried to get him to reduce testing on COVID because that'll bring my numbers down, and then pretend it's a joke, even though it wasn't a joke. So, I don't know if that answers the sort of first of a series of questions that you presented there.
Maybe
But
we
I
could
do
do
think
the
that's
Biden
important,
later.
thinking about your larger claim about democracy, right? Like how does a democratic republic, how does a democracy work in a place in which the media functions like this or something? Yes.
What I was saying is maybe we could do this, continue a bit later on the question of what to do now, because they are separate, and maybe I should have waited. I was just excited to ask both questions. So let me go back to Mouin and ask Mouin if he is able to. Let me get Mouin on the. Okay, if I can ask Mouin to tell us a little bit about what seem to be the priorities of a Biden foreign policy, even if we're not 100% in a situation right now to make those claims. What is, in your view, the lay of the land in terms of Biden foreign policy, and how will his administration approach them? We've seen today on the news all sorts of names popping up for different key positions, and why he might be swayed one way or another. So and how these will be affected by the legacy of Trump.
Well,
You
I think
you
I would
have
start.
2.5 hours to respond.
I think I would start, Bassam, by pointing out that to a significantly greater extent than any recent U.S. administration, Biden is going to be very much preoccupied with very serious domestic crises, COVID, economic collapse, polarization within the U.S., and so on and so forth. So foreign policy is already, I think, from the outset, a second order priority. At the same time, states and their institutions do have the capacity to walk and chew gum at the same time. So it's not like there won't be a foreign policy. I think I'm presuming that for the US, the first priority will be seeking to repair traditional alliances with the European Union, other alliances that are with NATO, other alliances that are perhaps less formal, putting them back on a more quote unquote normal footing. I think the problem that the Americans are going to face is if it was in the past true that the world looked at the US with either fear or admiration, I think it's fair to say that Trump's constant accusation that his predecessors were making the US a global laughingstock has become something of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I would say that much of the world today looks at the US with either pity or contempt. So I think that's a significant change. The second is that, yes, you can repair traditional alliances, for example, in Europe. But in the back of everyone's mind is going to be not only has this just happened, but it's provided a very clear demonstration that it can and perhaps will happen once again in 4 or 8 years. The second priority, I think, is going to be the U.S. relationship with Russia and China, and I think there's a lot of bad blood in Washington about Russia because of all of Russia's activities, real and imagined, in terms of the U.S. political process in the past 4 years, and I think you will perhaps start seeing some more assertive efforts by the U.S. vis-a-vis Russia, not only in the bilateral relationship, but also in regions like the Middle East, while at the same time trying to reconstitute the arms control regime that was dismantled to a very significant degree by the Trump administration. So I think those kind of big picture priorities will consume the Biden administration, at least in its first 1 to 2 years. Bearing in mind, there are always going to be crises that emerge out of nowhere, and I think part of the approach of the Biden administration will be to kind of rejoin the organizations and treaties that the U.S. Has withdrawn from in the past few years, like the WHO, the Paris Climate Accords, and so on. Did I keep to my time?
Yes, I'm shocked. Shukran. Thank you, Mouin. Char, let's go back, if you don't mind, to the question of democracy. As much as you want to expand on it, and what can be done in the meantime, right now, not in the meantime, today, now, and in the future, regarding basically pushing Biden and pushing him in the sense that the new administration will have the power to an extent to do good on some of the promises, but those promises are not going to sort of unfold on their own. There's going to be a lot of push and pull. There's going to be the idea of uniting America, which is basically moving towards the center, satisfying the other side in order to realistically get things done. Also, depending on what happens in the Senate, there's also going to be a constituency that has developed and expanded in the past few years, not least regarding race issues and climate change, that is going to wait and see if there is going to be any change in those regards, and probably do a lot more than wait and see. So if you can address the question of democracy and what to do now that Biden is likely to, not likely, is the next president. We say likely because a good part of the country is not on the same train.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's a couple. One is, I think that it's a little bit probably to think that the change is going to come from within the administration seems, as Mouin is kind of pointing out, I think, like in an international context, like that's not a good hope. I don't think. If in fact some of the sort of ways that we've seen anti-democratic or anti-democratic kind of processes within the United States have been exposed pretty clearly in the last 4 years. I don't think that's going to come from the White House. I think it's going to come from the movements that have brought it, that made this happen in some ways, like the movement that pushed Biden to make some agreements that he didn't seem to want to make. And I think you're connecting that up with the Black Lives Matter protest. Is like there's people who are learning how to protest and consistently put pressure on institutions to move, and I have hope that that doesn't go away. And I think as Mouin was saying at the very beginning, like there's the immediate transfer here to opposing Biden, right? That it just went from fighting Trump to now sort of, and that seems to me to be the right move, because I mean you can see like the people he's appointing to these various agency review teams are very much the same people who got us into Afghanistan, who have been part of administrations that are now the object of a lot of criticism from a lot of the movement that actually really benefited Biden during this election. I don't think they're going to go away, and I don't think Biden knows how to do it otherwise. And I think the pressure's got to come outside the administration and from the streets, probably. I think I would also say, just to, so.
I can't hear anything.
Yeah, it seems like we have lost Char.
Mm.
Um, the internet in the United States is kind of approaching Beirut level sometimes because of everything happening
What
online.
happened to Infrastructure Week?
But he paused, he froze in a decent manner, which is
Mm.
unfortunately we have to
Mm.
let's go on, and he's probably going to be able to call back, and maybe we could there he is. Let me
Well, if I could just pick up on a point he made while he
please do,
rejoined.
and then when he comes back, I'll bring him in.
I mean,
Go
there's
ahead.
kind of an interesting parallel here between the U.S. and Egypt a decade ago. If you remember the uprising in Egypt, millions of people went out into the streets. Mubarak left office, and to a large extent, the popular movement declared victory and went home. And then first they got the Muslim Brotherhood, and then they got Sisi, who was still there. And I wonder the extent to which Americans who were strongly opposed to Trump and his agenda view, the protests over the summer and then Trump's electoral defeat as kind of the completion rather than the beginning of their task, and will now kind of sit back and leave governance to the politicians and the elites who are now back in power. And I think that's a pretty scary thought that more or less would guarantee that in 4 or 8 years we will see Trump version 2.0.
Thank you. Char, we had lost you. I'm assuming you're back.
I think I'm back.
Yeah.
I don't know what
with
happened.
better
Anything too
audio.
critical, and you guys really shut a man off, don't you?
Yeah, you started critiquing Trump, and
That was it.
That's it.
it's basically like being in Syria and talking about the regime, and all of a sudden the phone cuts off, which is like the best scenario if the phone just cuts off rather than other things, getting cut off. Okay, so Shar, Mouin interjected and talked a little bit about Egypt and some similarities, but if you would like to go on, the floor is yours. Assume that you got cut off halfway.
Okay. Yeah, I was just going on with the lack of specific kind of points about how you go about kind of rewriting the American constitutional system. And I have to say, I think it's a question worth raising more, in the ways in which it's legitimated according to democratic conceptions, yet it works systematically to neglect those requirements. In some ways, it seems like you've got to really work through this, and I don't think, and I think these changes are pretty severe, and I don't know how to answer them, but I also am unwilling to take them off the table or to stop talking about them. Again, that DC doesn't have representation, that Puerto Rico doesn't have representation, that the Electoral College renders massive numbers of votes kind of pointless. Like all of that absurdity, that anti-democratic absurdity kind of needs to be addressed seriously. And again, I don't know how you do that, but in the same way that we're talking kind of broadly about public understandings of the United States as a kind of world leader or a leader in democracy, the way that we're talking about that looking increasingly absurd. Not, Trump helps make it look more absurd, but that it highlights a kind of absurdity that may be lurking there much more pervasively. I hope you don't get to put that back in some ways. I mean, I guess that would be a sort of take here. Is I don't want it to go back to the way it was. If that means I don't have congressional representation, even though I live in the country. Even though I'm a citizen, I don't get to say what happens with Congress and the Senate. And that seems even kind of trivial, connected perhaps to the massive incarceration. And this goes back to Bassam's kind of connecting this to the Black Lives Matter protests, but the way in which you are locking up the same number of African American men who were slaves at the end of the Civil War are now in prison. I mean, that requires that you take a serious examination of what's going on here, and kind of politically engage it and make it better.
Thank you.
Can I just ask, you've
Go
made
ahead.
the case for these issues should be on the agenda, but do you think they will be on the agenda?
I don't think they're not on Biden's agenda. They are on the agendas of people who are still in the streets, basically. And they are pushing, right, and they are having some impact in Congress. But yeah, back to the very beginning. I don't see this coming from the White House, and I'm as happy as anybody to see Biden occupy the White House compared to what we just experienced. But I'm in a pretty privileged position in a lot of ways. I'm not in Yemen or Afghanistan, where the difference may be pretty negligible about who's getting drone striked. But so there's there's a. I think we are at a. I don't want that to disappear in the conversation, I guess. What do you think, Lisa?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that at this point we have been going for about 34 minutes. Please do feel free to engage each other. I have a lot to share, but I'm doing these interviews and discussing this with a number of people so I can have my say. So please feel free to engage each other as well, Mouin and Char. So Mouin, he's throwing the ball back into your park.
Yeah, well, I'd asked Char if he thinks these issues will be on the agenda, and he made the case that if that happens, it's not going to be from the leadership, but because of pressure on the leadership, and I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think that's also the case with respect to foreign policy. I mean, Char, you mentioned Yemen. I think that's actually one place where there could be a change, because while I think all the criticism of Saudi Arabia and its rulers during the campaign is basically boilerplate campaign rhetoric, and I don't anticipate any significant changes in U.S.-Saudi relations. Biden administration, one issue on which there has been increasingly um, strong opposition from core constituencies in the Democratic Party, including from much of its congressional faction, is the war in Yemen. And that is something I think where the Biden administration may feel compelled to exercise significant uh, pressure on Saudi Arabia, and in order to bring this conflict to an end, or at least to end, let's say, the hot war phase of that conflict. Another one, I think, is the GCC crisis, which, to my mind, has been permitted to fester because of Washington's indulgence for the Saudi Emirati blockade of Qatar. That's another one where I think the Biden administration, probably at the urging of the Pentagon, will say, "Okay, this is not in our interest. This needs to end." But on more significant issues, in terms of a meaningful reorientation of U.S. foreign policy, I pretty much agree with you. I don't see that happening either.
I was hoping we would have some sort of disagreement, but maybe I invited the wrong people. Um, okay, so Mouin and Char, I mean, we kind of should begin wrapping up, given that as we wrap up, things are going to come up, and we're going to be talking about a number of things. Um, Mouin, regarding foreign policy, the sticking point in specifically Middle East policy, there are a few sticking points actually. There's Iran and there's Palestine, but few others as well, including Saudi Arabia, of course. But this is less of a controversial point, given that the U.S. and Saudi relations have been less rocky than, say, the U.S. Palestine matters or U.S. Iran matters. Do you think the some of the policies that are blatantly like settler colonial that Trump supported in terms of annexation, which is in the 21st century, with the exception of certain countries and certain constituencies like in Israel or the United States and a few other countries, are preposterous for the rest of humanity. The annexation of whether it's the Golan, the West Bank, and the continuation of everything else, which is not necessarily a Trump product, but a Trump assertion, because the de facto situation has been what Trump simply asserted. Do you think this will change in any substantive way beyond niceties? And then with Iran, what do you think can be done? Let alone, of course, I mean, forget other questions of what should be done. Like, forget the let's move, beyond the
Yeah. Well,
the ought.
those are, I think, two very instructive examples. I think in the case of Iran, something will change for the very simple reason that Iran has the capacity to do very significant damage to U.S. interests and to the interests of close U.S. allies of the region if it's just ignored and this policy of maximum pressure is allowed to continue. In other words, Iran has leverage, and Iran can and will use that leverage unless its interests are in one way or another addressed. And I think they will be. It's too early to say what the outcome is because, well, I think, again, as I was saying earlier, well, I think Biden would like to rejoin the nuclear agreement that was renounced by Trump. You can't just pretend the past 4 years didn't happen. And I think Biden will seek to go beyond just Iran reverting from the measures it took during the past 2 years, and will seek some kind of additional assurances on Iranian nuclear activities or Iranian regional conduct. And in exchange, I think Iran is going to demand much firmer um, uh, guarantees about respect for the agreement, the lifting of sanctions, and so on. So it's not something that can happen overnight. Now you look at Palestine. Palestine has essentially faded from view in the past few years, which speaks not only to the success of the Israelis in dealing with the Palestinians, but also the paralysis that has come to exist in Palestinian ranks. And I think, yes, there's a very compelling case to be made for viewing the Trump administration policy on Palestine as, in many respects, the logical culmination of 70 years of U.S. policy, or putting the policy of previous administration on steroids. At the same time, there was a significant difference. Previous administrations have tended to embrace the policies of the Israeli government of the day, irrespective of what that government is and what its agenda is. Under Trump, you had a policy, as you had in other parts of the world, of openly embracing the most extreme agenda on the Israeli political spectrum, irrespective of how it related to the Israeli consensus. So, for example, issues like annexation, cutting off U.S. Funding for the UN Refugee Agency and so on. These are not necessarily Israeli. These are not necessarily positions of the Israeli consensus, and they're very closely identified with the far right of the Israeli spectrum, and were nevertheless openly embraced by the Trump administration. Now, I suspect annexation is off the agenda. I would hope that there is no prospect for resuming what passed for the peace process. And at least initially, we'll see a return to, let's call it, the settler colonial status quo that we've had in the occupied territories and particularly the West Bank, where under Biden, the U.S. will restore diplomatic relations with the Palestinians. We'll see a financial crisis as being against rather than support of U.S. interests, but will not address the fundamental issues. And here's the difference between the Palestinians and the Iranians. The Palestinians need to find a way to unsettle the status quo, to draw attention to these issues, to make it in the interests of others to deal with these issues, because their interests will be damaged if they don't. And that, I think, is a very tall order, not likely, but far from impossible.
Thank you. Thanks, Mouin. Char, do you think, and this is, I'm going to ask you to answer, and if you would like to make this sort of your closing also statement, are we at a point, at a juncture where there's a real opportunity, at least in terms of national politics, for things to advance in the direction of social justice regarding all sorts of topics, whether it's race, class, gender, climate change, things that actually affect everyone, especially those who are, usually marginalized historically? Is there such a juncture and opportunity, or is it likely to be politics as usual with cosmetic changes? I mean, it's not a fair question. But I'm going to ask it to you.
Sure, I'll answer. I think there are real possibilities, right? And part of it could be that in opposing Trump, you've generated movements who know how to get things done. They know how to take over the streets. They know how to communicate. You've got, so there is this group ready to keep pushing for the things they want to achieve out of this. And again, I think somebody like the Black Lives Matter movement had been very successful in a bunch of ways. Not as successful as they want to be, but this has really set discussions, and the status of the police in the future are on the table in a way I wouldn't have imagined 3 years ago. And that's, again, made possible by these movements on the streets pushing for it. I don't think that's going away. So I think I hope it doesn't go away, and I don't think it goes away. And I think that I see some real possibilities there to bring about a better place. I also think like some of the pressures are pretty huge in the future. Climate change is going to become an incredibly powerful force that's going to work in all kinds of ways. And I think that the need to act soon and with in a lot of areas along an issue like that, it's hard to say how that plays out, but there's reasons to be optimistic about the role of the success with which people have mobilized on a number of other issues recently. That's not going to be off the table, or that's going to be a real possibility. I want to go back to sort of the thing Mouin has been saying about the phrase of like you can't go back to business. You can't just go. You can't pretend it didn't happen, right? Like this 4 years of treating all your international relationships as if you can get rid of them anytime, as if they don't mean anything to you. You can't go back. I mean, that's going to be something to watch, right? I mean, not just internationally, like as the United States tries to just do a reset on that, and occupy their position of their various positions of dominance, or privilege in that, internationally, but also domestically. I mean, I think that it's going to be a thing to watch as, the Republicans will promise the Democrats that they'll never do that again, that they want the norms to come back, and they promise they'll be good. And my sense of the Democrats will go along with that. But again, I think that there's pressure there now to kind of say, if your norm is just dependent on one party kind of following it, it's not really a norm. You've really got to think about the political power involved. It's not just, these things aren't just, you don't just get them because somebody's nice, because eventually somebody's not nice and you don't get it. You get these norms, you get these rules, you get these long-term agreements because people have political power. And in that way, I mean, again, I think there's a lot of, there's a lot of terrifying futures, and a lot of futures that are better. And I think, both domestically and internationally, that there's a lot to be gained by people having the power to assert what they need out of the world, whether that's a non-United States country or prison protesters, right? That part of a sort of takeaway theme here would be the importance of power, right, and the importance of democratically diverse positions of power to act on each other. And that's, again, I think that's something that at this, in which, a bunch of people are going to say, let's just reset and pretend it didn't happen. There's a lot of people that aren't, as Mouin's saying, like they're not going to take that. They realize that if they have power, they don't have to rely on the goodwill of others. They can assert what they want, and make it better for them and for others. So.
And not just the ballot box.
Right. No, not just the ballot box. I mean, yeah, absolutely.
And Mouin, is this a juncture in terms of foreign policy? Is this a juncture that is significant? Is there an opportunity here? I know that domestic politics can be easier to sort of maneuver, relatively speaking, and we're all cynical about foreign policy, especially with respect to particular areas like Middle East politics. Is there a real opportunity, or is it again business as usual, and incumbents would have to go out of their way and jeopardize their own positions in order to push for radical change, again in the direction of social justice, or we can say easily in the direction of the self-professed values, quote unquote, of the United States?
Well, I would fully agree with Char. I think with Trump's ouster, again, assuming that he is ejected from the White House in January, I think that probably the best way to see it is, again, one should not conflate relief with Trump's ouster with kind of satisfaction with Biden's election. I think with Trump out of the picture, some of the catastrophic scenarios, for example, with respect to climate change, what we have instead are opportunities. And whether those opportunities are realized or not is not, if we leave it to the good faith of Joe Biden. Of course, they're never going to happen, and it will depend very much, I think, on not just what happens in the world, but also very much on how these battles play out in the United States. And I think one encouraging sign, again, picking up on what Chara said, if you would have had the Republicans in power again, um, the pressure on them would have come from the extreme right, from the white evangelicals and so on. With this administration in power, the constituencies that will be seeking to influence them are, more rational and at least dedicated to the survival of civilization. So I think I would say that there are real opportunities, and in that respect, it could be a turning point. And just very briefly, I think another one is that um, experience matters, and I think after what people have experienced the past 4 years globally, it's very difficult for them to continue looking at the US the way they have before. To a certain extent, the barrier of fear has been broken, and it will be very difficult for the US to kind of restore its global leadership position with a snap of its fingers.
Well, thank you so much, both of you. I think this is it's time. We're approaching an hour. Thank you for your commentary and the kind of like unreasonable expectation that I had to ask you about all these things so fresh after the election, in which things are not conclusive yet, at least for a good portion of the American public, and certainly for the Trump campaign. I'm not gonna ask this question later. I'm just always like asking about how to deal with the rest of the country, with people in the rest of the United States, basically in the sense that there are millions of people who just don't buy what just happened at a time when we have quote unquote bought it, whether or not you believe in the political system or you believe in its efficacy or its legitimacy. People just accept, okay, this person won. So this is always a question I ask, because in the end, this is a democracy, and if you don't like someone or their views, I mean, there's a process, and you're supposed to respect it, and so this is always an issue. But I'm not going to ask it. Maybe another time we'll
Well,
talk
just
about.
briefly, I think in post-war Germany they called it denazification.
Oh, so de-Trumpification. I don't think. See, the thing is that
I think that's a great idea, by the way. I don't think you should just, yeah, I mean, there has to be trials, right? People need to be, like Trump's violation of the Hatch Act, this needs to be heard. I mean, we can't have Obama forgiving Bush again. I mean, if Biden comes in and says, like, let's build this bridge where we're all got to get together, and forget that Trump obviously violated the Hatch Act in front of everybody. I mean, on top of all of the other things he could possibly, and his facilitators could be tried for. Like, I think, I mean, I'm sort of changing it from a denazification, like everyone's got to go to training,
Well,
to
accountability.
set up
Yeah.
people on to an account. I'm sorry.
he said accountability. Okay, well, I mean, this I understand that, but that's regarding the high policy and the people in charge. But there are human beings that are citizens that have bought into this, and it's a little less discreet than the World War II situation, which is why it's a little tougher to come to a consensus on and proceed. So it is something that to ponder. Plus, quote unquote, it's not over yet, and I guess there might be another election in 4 years in which this might all come back. Anyway, thank you both very much. And I appreciate the time you have given us. This is also part of the Char Conversations, which is a podcast at the Char School, in collaboration with the Jadaliyya and statushour.com. And thank you, Mouin, for staying up in Holland, or in The Hague. I never know where you are, by the way.
The pleasure, Bassam.
To be with us.
Char.
Thanks, Char.
Thank you both.
And
Thank you,
thanks to
Mouin.
Thank you.
thanks to everybody who's joining us. All right, take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.